Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Leanne Deleg, and I'm responsible for communications here at Climate Outreach. And I will be introducing shortly my colleague, Dr. Christopher Shaw, who's sitting next to me, as well as Raggy Lowe of ClimateXChange, who will also be contributing to the webinar. So we're excited to see people from around Scotland. We looked at the participant list where you included your organization, but it's fantastic to see most of Scottish council representatives, lots of environmental organizations in Scotland, as well as government organizations and people from around the world. And we have a lot of people who will be listening to the recording as well, who are not able to join us live, and we'll be sending you a recording of the webinar within the next week. So just a few brief, introduction to who Climate Outreach is. So we're a nonprofit based in the UK and increasingly working with partners from around the world. And our focus is on how can we communicate about climate change more effectively, and specifically values-based communication. So how can we communicate in ways that resonate with the values of the people that we're talking with, of our audiences. And we work with a range of organizations, so government, nonprofits, business, etc. And we conduct social research into the social science of climate change communication, but also translate that into practice. And so we try and produce resources that inform your work that are evidence-based and practical. So just a few brief items regarding technology and logistics. So if you're having any technical issues, you can use the chat feature, which is on the right-hand side of your screen, to communicate with me, and that's Climate Outreach is the name that I'm under in the chat feature. And you're welcome to type in any content-related questions at any point during the webinar. We'll get to the Q&A in the last 15, 20 minutes of the session. So again, please do send in any questions as they come in about what you're hearing. If you're on Twitter, we will be tweeting using the hashtag #ClimateConversations. Again, that's Climate Conversations, which is on your screen, and you're welcome to join with us. And and so now I'd like to introduce Dr. Christopher Shaw, who's our senior researcher and has been leading on this project with the Scottish Government and ClimateXChange, going up to Scotland and meeting with groups and looking at how we can build, effective public conversations about climate change that really plant the seeds for meaningful engagement. And Raggy Lowe will also be joining us. She is a project manager at ClimateXChange, which is a center of expertise in Scotland linking climate research and policy. And this is the organization that commissioned us to do the work for the Scottish Government. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Christopher.
Thanks very much, Leanne. Thanks also to everyone for joining us today. Yes, so as my colleague said, my name is Christopher Shaw. I led on this project with a number of other partners. And the presentation today, what we will do, will last till 5 o'clock, the webinar, so there'll be kind of 10 minutes background. We've had some of the background already. 10 minutes I'll talk through the methodology, how we carried out the research, then 20 minutes going through the results and next steps for the project. And as Leanne said, if you have any questions, type them in as we go through and I'll pick them up at the end. Okay, so I think what I would like to do is just start with, I guess, an overview picture of what we were doing with this project and the kind of foundation for the approach we took with the conversations, which was there before we began this project, and then what we were finding as we moved through the workshops, through the analysis of what emerged, was kind of confirming this approach. And that initial framework, that approach's assumptions, I guess, underpinned what we were doing, is that climate change is essentially a question about what sort of future we want, what kind of world we want for ourselves, for our family, for the next generations and generations beyond that. In essence, we're asking questions about what is fair, who wins, who loses in a world where there's limited opportunities for emissions of climate change gases, etc. So the questions that everyone can engage with. This is where we sort of begin the climate conversations. It's where we begin a lot of our workshops with our narrative methodology. And we begin it there because that's the sort of question. It's those wishes, those fears, those aspirations that we all have something to say about. So it's an inclusive discussion. So we begin the conversations in that space. Then once we're up and running in that space, this is where the facilitator and the resources come in, because then the key is to bring climate change into that conversation and to keep climate change at the core of that conversation. So often we find that conversations around this issue just veer off into all sorts of different areas. And I guess it's in part because there's the kind of problem climate change is, it affects so many different areas of all our lives. And what I'm saying is that's a very different way of approaching, beginning this process than starting graphs or pictures of pollution, talking about atmospheric concentrations of CO2, etc. So it's a very different approach that we adopt. So that's what we're going to talk through in this webinar. The nuts and bolts of how we developed that framework for engagement for the climate conversations. What we did, what we found, how we applied that, and some thoughts about what could happen next. So this is not a tutorial in running a climate change conversation, and there's two reasons for that. Firstly, because a webinar is not a useful, suitable mechanism for doing that. And secondly, we ran 6 workshops. There were 3 workshops which were focus groups, and then 3 which were piloting the methodology, the climate conversations methodology. We're also doing some research as part of that process, trying to get some information about where the Scottish public were with climate change, what they understood about climate change, what they felt about climate change, as well as trying to trial materials, test what worked, what didn't, get a sense of what kind of level of complexity we could introduce into the conversation. So there's a lot going on within those 6. Now, subsequent to that, the Scottish Government has commissioned another 20 workshops with a research function, but also to test out further some of the recommendations and resources that were part of those initial recommendations. So I think, and I'm going to hear at the end of this some initial feedback from those additional 20 workshops, conversations. But I think it'd be a bit kind of premature at the moment to be talking about those when there could be some additional information coming in. So what I would like to do first is just say thank you to the other partners and members of the project team. And then once I've done that, I'm going to ask Raggy to talk about some of the background to the climate conversations and why they were an appropriate step for the Scottish Government to be taken at this stage. And obviously for us, it's a very great privilege to be involved in what is an innovative and we think groundbreaking project that has a lot of applications within Scotland and beyond. So it was very pleased to have the chance to be part of this and work with partners both in Scotland, community groups, practitioners, researchers, and the government. So I was the lead on this project and supported by Dr. Adam Corner, Lydia Messing, and Leanne, who you've already met. Worked with Darcy Pimblett at ClimateXChange, a project and information manager. Darcy's just recently left ClimateXChange, gone back to Australia, so I'm very glad that Raggy is able to kind of step in his place today and give the perspective from ClimateXChange. Also, very grateful for support and help from Helen Mansbridge and Debbie Sagar of the Scottish Government. And the Shawfoot Effect facilitated the workshops, the 6 workshops that we did. I was, as I mentioned, they were split into 2 kind of groups. There was a focus group to begin with, the first 3, and the second 3 were pilot groups. So I was present at the first of each of those, but it was Shawfoot Effect who did a very good job of facilitating those groups and worked closely with them, getting feedback from what was working, what wasn't. So that was, again, they were very key to the success of this project. And before I pass over to Raggy, I think it's probably useful, and Raggy may pick this up, but just to confirm really what the purpose of the project was, what the background to it was, what would we be asked to do in this project. And ClimateXChange commissioned the development and piloting of a framework for a climate change public conversation series. And the purpose of that was to enable the Scottish Government to initiate constructive conversations with publics across Scotland about climate change. And the conversation series was designed to explore public knowledge of, attitudes towards, and engagement with climate change, policies to address climate change, and the future transition to a sustainable low-carbon society. The ultimate purpose of the conversations is to help inform the development and communication of climate change policies in Scotland. So that's kind of the background from my perspective. So before I begin to move on to talking about a bit more detail about the methodology, I'm going to ask if Raggy can just spend a few moments explaining from ClimateXChange's perspective the purpose and the context for the Climate Conversations project.
Okay, thank you very much. My name's Raggy, and some of you, I think, looking at the list may already have come across me in one way or another. As Chris has said, ClimateXChange is funded by the Scottish Government to support with evidence and research the policy-making process around climate change mitigation and adaptation. And this is one of a number of projects that we've been engaged with that have considered how to raise awareness, begin conversations, develop those conversations, and understand better where publics are at on issues around climate and energy. And it's now very gratifying to see that it's being taken forward, as Chris suggested, in live testing, as it were, in a further 20 conversations, which I'll speak a little bit about towards the end of the webinar. Just to give you some context then for the project overall, as I'm sure all of you know, Scotland has a very ambitious series of climate mitigation targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that's really the starting point for this project and for a lot of the Scottish Government's other work in engaging the public and in supporting communities to take action on climate change. So the Scottish Government has long run a fund that supports community action called the Climate Challenge Fund, has a number of other grants and support available to communities and the public in terms of individual household action that can be taken and community action, including community-owned renewables and so on. And so this project really fits into that bigger picture of opening up a wider public awareness and conversation on climate change and particularly what can be done about it. And I think this one was particularly interesting in terms of the timing, because the Scottish Government needs to develop what they're calling now a climate change plan, which will be issued in the late winter for public consultation, which sets out how Scotland will achieve some of the more challenging aspects of carbon reduction in the late 2020s and early 2030s. And that transition will be deep and will affect every aspect of citizens' lives. So beginning a much deeper conversation with the public is absolutely kind of core to developing that climate change plan and understanding how people understand climate change, how they feel about it and what they feel they can do about it. So I'll stop there and let Chris continue with the sort of meat of the project.
Okay, thanks, Frankie. Okay, yes, and I think this is as you say, this very deep engagement that's going to be required to meet those targets is obviously central to this. So what we did with this, I'm going to just run through quickly the kind of stages to this project, and there were a few stages. The first thing that we did and were asked to do was to pull together a desk review to identify best practice in climate change engagement, participatory practices, and combine that with our own experience and expertise to inform the development of the framework and the approaches we would be taking in the workshops. And so we reviewed 15 projects and the literature around mostly UK engagement with climate change. From that process, it kind of confirmed that the narrative workshop methodology that we've been using for, I guess, 10 years now is a good example of best practice. It wasn't really much that we saw there that we weren't doing, wasn't being reflected in what we did. So from that, we then held, as I mentioned, 3 focus groups. They each ran for 2.5 hours, and they had a strong research objective, understanding public attitudes to climate change at a deep level through those, because we weren't reaching a lot of people, because they're in-depth qualitative research. And then 3 pilot groups, which were piloting what we had identified as potentially appropriate approaches to use for the climate conversations. From that process, ultimately 4 outputs were produced. There was a how-to guide, the desk review itself, research results, and a framework which explains, it's kind of the bridge between what we found and the recommendations we've made in the how-to guide. So it's explaining why we've made those recommendations. And I think a lot of the changes, what we also did once we produced these documents initially, we went up and had a meeting with community groups in Scotland, shared with them what we'd found, got feedback on what they thought might be useful, what more they would want to find, and also there's a chance for us to ask some questions about kind of recruiting for groups, etc. And then subsequently there was a fair bit of work in kind of stripping out all this information so there was a useful how-to guide, so there wasn't a big bulk. What we produced was a kind of cradle to grave, A to Z of running a workshop, which becomes a very big document. So process of kind of stripping those out so that what community groups could pick up off the shelf was a bit more usable, a bit less kind of intimidating. So those are the steps in a nutshell, we took to get to these outputs. And these are the findings that we got from the desk review that informed how we designed the workshops and how we ran those workshops. And what we found going through the desk review, that those 15 projects that we looked at, most of those were about consultation and research, in the sense they were about kind of saying, well, this is what's going to happen, or they're about getting information out of the audience that was turning up for the workshops. Nothing wrong with that. There's another strand of participatory work which says that work should kind of develop the democratic muscles of the citizenry, if you will. It's sort of meant to kind of make the decision-making process itself more democratic. There wasn't a lot of that happening in the ones that we saw. What we also found was looking at the reflections of the people who'd run the groups where those were available to interrogate and look at, that organising discussion groups, participatory exercises is time-consuming and expensive. Recruiting participants is often a challenge and normally requires payment to the participants, and even then there's no guarantee that you'll get the people you want in the room. The length of time needed for discussion groups was often 3 half-day sessions, so quite onerous, quite a commitment required from members of the public and to get involved in that. The groups usually require a high level of climate change expertise and facilitation expertise, talking about, often you might have, for example, an outside expert come in and give a presentation. So these were quite typical of what we were seeing. Those, I've listed kind of challenges, difficulties, but what was common was participants did enjoy the process, enjoyed the chance to be involved and to learn more about the issues around climate change. But the point being that how do you get from that to what we wanted to get to, which was a conversation, which was something light, easy, not expensive, not requiring large amounts of expertise. So there was the challenge, and this is what this project was about. How do you get from what is the norm, big, unwieldy, expensive, time-consuming process to something that could be initiate a conversation and be much easier to use, much more accessible. So what we did was we ran these 6 workshops, and Shawford facilitated those. So the phase 1 research workshops, 2.5 hours each. That is our narrative workshop methodology. Those workshops generally run for 2.5 hours. But of course, it came apparent as we go through the process that for the users of the outputs, that's too long. That's not going to be possible to run an event, a discussion that runs for that long. So how do we get from that to something a bit shorter? What we found, and again, I think you'll see here with the first set of workshops, normally you'd only want to find 7 or 8 people for a discussion. That's enough to allow everyone to talk, give time for everyone to talk. Because we have some expertise in this, because we want to do some research as well, we kind of pulled a lot more people in. But when we went to Perth, only 5 participants pulled up. There was no clear reason why that was. It wasn't, as we looked at it afterwards, why only 5 came. There was the weather was particularly bad that night or anything. But this just speaks to this, the issue around recruitment can be a challenge sometimes, well, all the time. So and of course, if you haven't got people in the room, then you're not going to have much of a conversation. So obviously that's one of the important things to get right. And then with the piloting, we went for lower numbers. We were trying to just replicate what we thought a typical conversation might be like. And we were trying to get to 60 minutes. And you'll see in the framework that we provided, you could run it at 60 minutes. We did 70 minutes because there was some additional form filling we were doing at the end of the feedback forms. And some research, so ours ran for 70 minutes. So that was the structure, and again, one of the challenges we had was, if you look at Edinburgh happened on the 1st of February, Perth the 2nd of February, Oban on the 8th of February. There's not a lot of time in that. If something's going very wrong, or something we want to change, there isn't a lot of time to actually act upon that. So that, again, was one of the challenges we were working towards, and again, between Glasgow and Dumfries, is only just a couple of days between the 2 workshops. So it was kind of really just hitting it quite full on while we were in the mix to try and make sure that we were reacting and able to get those changes incorporated in time. What we did was we were looking at in the research groups, as part of the research, we were trying to think about, well, what does climate change mean to you, but also what does it mean in Scotland? And so that we were trying to see if there's anything unique about level of concern about climate change in Scotland, anything about the way that climate change was likely to impact in Scotland that was front of people's minds. And then we used some time for testing different visual activities, which we would take through to the piloting. And we also did some language testing. Now, this is not something that's going to be, it is intended to be part of the conversations, it's part of the research. We carried it over to the piloting as well, because we had the money had been spent on getting people to the room, and people were willing to stay behind for a bit longer and do some of the more language testing. Then we were just testing narratives, phrases, words, sentences that were being used in the Scottish Government's policy language or in its promotion of greener Scotland, and testing what was working and what wasn't working there. As you see in the pilot, and we're just trying to really reduce this down to, I guess, in that short time you've got a conversation about, well, what does climate change mean to you? What's the problem? And then the second part, well, what's the possible solution? So that's briefly what we're trying to get to, breaking the conversation down to those two parts. Because time's short, I'm not going to go into too much depth to these, but this is kind of the differences between the three focus group workshops and the differences in what we tested. And I guess, in essence, an overview, what we were asking there, as I say, is this question of, is Scotland a special, is climate change something different in Scotland to what we see when we do these groups elsewhere? Does Scotland face specific challenges compared to the rest of the UK, the rest of the world? What are current public attitudes and awareness, attitudes to and awareness of climate change? What level, what we're testing here as well, what level of complexity can we introduce into the workshops? When the resources, how kind of technical and scientific could they be and still be accessible to people? What was the correct, ideally we'd probably not use any text and just be all image-based, but there's an element of needing to include text as well. And so one of the questions really for us was, well, what's the right balance between text and image? Also, because we've got the issue of, it takes time to get through this stuff. So what level of content could you be using that would be valid for what would be a short workshop? I mean, 60 minutes, 70 minutes, none of the ones we're looking through at the desk review were that short. So this is something quite unique that we're trying to do here. And so a bit more detail again from what I showed a couple of slides ago about what we did in Scotland. So with the pilot group. So what I tried first when we were in Glasgow was some headlines, some sheets of paper that had different headlines and to be very kind of controversial. They're taken from real reports about damage and risk and all the rest of it. And actually found that it was quite polarizing and was not a productive way to go forward. So there's much more kind of, we changed that and using images and stuff to kind of root things in what people's reactions are when they think about climate change. And then moving on to how do you think that will affect the things that matter to you? And then finally, what we used for thinking about what are the appropriate solutions was the Scotland 2030 website and materials. We was looking at, well, what will a low carbon Scotland look like in 2030? Providing some photographs, illustrating some of those scenarios with a small amount of text and asking people what they thought about those, which of those they felt most amenable to, they would like, which they wouldn't like. Now, again, that's not really research. You're not getting the numbers to say, okay, Scotland's going to do this because X number of people have said they like it. But it's a way of getting the conversation going, get people thinking about climate change, what it's likely to mean for the future. It's doing that in an accessible way, photographs about the home, transport, what are things that people are familiar with. And that's what you're trying to do there, just get the conversation going, keeping it focused on climate change. And in that way, you're really achieving that goal. You're getting people talking about climate change. You're breaking the climate silence. So that briefly is kind of an overview of what we did. So let's talk about what we found then for this last part of this last 10 minutes or so before seeing if there's any questions. Okay, so what we did find was that participants lacked confidence talking about climate change. So if we went in and we used some resource that had was talking about numbers, in 100 years, the planet will have warmed by 2 degrees. You start introducing numbers into this, what happens into the conversation in science? What happens is kind of two things. People got defensive, and they said, there's a sense of, well, okay, you're moving this conversation onto a ground where I'm not as well educated as you, as well versed. I don't trust these numbers, and so it was not, again, a fruitful area to ground the conversation in. And also, you'd say, again, this is reflecting on the video, a stupidly simple video we showed in one workshop, and hearing and people saying, oh, well, 100 years, I don't mind, that's a long way away, or 2 degrees warmer. that sounds great. Can we have it 5 degrees warmer, please, because it's horrible and cold in Scotland. So it's just, you're not really getting very far with that kind of conversation. They were much happier to address the topic to their own personal experience, recollect that they may not have always been accurate. Everyone was, as we all do, our childhood summers were long, warm, and never-ending. But nonetheless, they would talk about their own personal experience, and entirely valid to do so, about when things were flowering compared to when they did do or whatever. So that was where people were comfortable talking about this. And kind of in a conflict, what was said about the numbers, but maybe supporting that. People did want more information. We heard that time and time again. Well, they wanted local to show us what's going to happen here. If you show me something shocking, then I'm going to start worrying about it. Now, obviously, that information is out there if people want to find it. So I think that's the key question, really. We weren't using the conversations as classroom. I think that's one of the key messages here, that we're not climate scientists, and the evidence around kind of filling people up with information and get the correct behaviour out, well, it's tenuous at best. So we weren't using this space as a classroom, and that's one of our recommendations, that you don't do that. But nonetheless, it leaves this unanswered question: where does this additional information come from? So a sense of kind of guilt about it. So worry about children, worry about wildlife, sort of the victims of climate change, the victims of our bad behaviours. Because we weren't bringing in, and I see this time and time again in the workshops that we run, because we were not bringing in discussion of the risk, people were relying on their own understanding of the impacts and risks. And that's actually, people at the moment, and it's interesting to hear what Raggy said about what's going to be happening in Scotland at the end of this year, people have a very limited understanding at the moment, the extent of the risks posed by climate change, the extent of the changes required to adapt to those changes and mitigate them. So there's a lot of work to be done still there. But I repeat, the conversations isn't the place to do that work. People bemoaned the lack of immediate coverage, or what they said was, well, you get one expert come on, say one thing, then another expert disagrees with them. We're left not knowing what's going on. So this sense of wanting consistent, reliable, trustworthy information. In terms of the impacts that were raised, or climate impacts that were raised, people were worried about flooding was the key one. People were very supportive of Scotland's role as a global leader on climate change. And in terms of changes to infrastructure, what should be done about climate change? Well, changes to the improvements to the transport networks were a key recurrent theme. When we did the language testing, what came out from that? Well, people like the all-in-this-together type messages. It's going to take action by us all, the sense that everyone's doing something. And one of the key things we heard repeatedly was that we want recognition for what we're doing already. Now, that may have only been recycling, but nonetheless, the sense of, well, we're trying to do what we can. Don't make us out to be shirking our duties. So there's sort of that in the messaging, recognising people are doing what they can, they're willing to do more, and they want to do it more in conjunction with other organisations, people, institutions in Scotland. They like messages which were positive about a low carbon future and put people at the centre of that, investing in our people. So the environment is something that has people in it, the nature of the future. The idea of a fairer and more prosperous Scotland was very well received. And the language which evokes pride in Scotland and its achievements was again something that was tested very well. What people didn't like, and what we've seen in other research, is language. If it was just saying, well, talking about ambition without any real specifics, people were kind of cynical about that. Also, technical language, as you'd expect, given what I said before, the ideas of low carbon transitions, terms like that don't just leave people cold. The current use of science and graphs, again, as I've mentioned, just doesn't work for people. They don't feel it's an area in which a field of knowledge base in which they can really be part of. And then uncertainties, again, focus on what is known rather than focusing on the unknowns, because that sort of gives people a reason for not engaging. So coming back to thoughts about the framework, this document which kind of spells out, and this I'm only just giving very brief top line summaries here. There's lots more in the actual documents about the thinking that emerged that informed the development of the conversations. Is participants were able to engage and talk about climate change and think about the future, and knew enough to be able to talk in that area, but when it was not a technical discussion, when it was a discussion about the future and the future they wanted. Using these visual prompts with everyday language worked to allow people to kind of get to grips with what was otherwise an abstract phenomenon, and also keep the conversation focused on that, because again, people bring in a lot of baggages, maybe too derogatory a term, but a lot of other stuff into the discussion. Before you know it, you can be into discussions of fines for parking and all sorts going on. So it's very key to make sure you've got the right resources to keep the conversation focused, given that they're quite short space of time gone. We heard, participants will be motivated to get involved in the conversations. They know their opinions are going to get heard. If somehow that this could get fed back to the government, they know that their voices count, and that is a good motivator. To the extent people say, well, look, we don't really want money for companies, thank you for the money, but we'd probably come along for a cup of tea and a slice of cake. People enjoy the chance to kind of be heard, which I guess is contradiction to some what we hear about the decline of political participation going on. And again, as we saw, what we're saying is it should be grounded discussions of climate change in stories and people in direct experience of the world. That is the bridge, that is the path into discussion of the more abstract issues of the future. But you can't start with those discussions, abstract discussions of the science in the future. Just people have got no way of getting really becoming part of that conversation, just feel challenged by it. So what, in the how-to guide, and I'm going to be passing back over to Raggy in a minute to just talk about how these recommendations have been playing out in these additional workshops that have been run by the groups up in Scotland, Sniffer and Shawford. But we break it down into a structure there that allows for different options, depending on what resources and facilities you've got in the room. You might say, well, I want to show a video, but you're not certain if you've got the ability facilities to show a video in the room, the venue, and it's that could be difficult. But what that sort of key recommendations we're making is something we trialled, and this is building with something that we've done as an organisation at What You Love and what Shawford have been doing. Is a beginning with a called What You Love photo activity. I won't go into any depth here because there isn't time. And then this sort of Scotland 2030, engaging it with that through something called a Diamond 9 activity, which allows people to kind of sort through the images and think about which they most prefer and which they least prefer. But all this is laid out in the handbooks. And so I'm going to just speak to this slide, and then I'm going to pass to Raggy to talk about findings emerging from what's been going on with the additional kind of trialling and piloting of the conversations, which is these 20 ones that are there in the left-hand column. But what we are finding is as we're moving forward now, we've a lot of interest in this from other countries. In Ireland, we're doing some work in India, we're taking some of these learnings over to there, and also with some work in England. So we think there's some really interesting findings here that have broad application about how to start building a sustained national conversation about climate change. I feel this great example of building from the grassroots up conversation rather than this top-down discourse, which has characterised much of the communications for for 20 years or more. And this process, it just reduces the need for facilitation expertise and science expertise in the room, allows for broader perspectives into the debate, both within the room but then at a national level. And we feel this is really potentially a missing piece of the jigsaw, connecting top-down policy and science discourses and what people on the ground are feeling. We feel this is really something we can start to connect those two. So that is all that I had to say, and I just wondered, we've got just under 15 minutes now, so thanks again for your attention over that time, and we've got some time for some questions if there are any.
Yes, thank you, Chris. So the first, one of the first questions that has come in is following up on what you said about the fact that during these workshops you found that there was an interest from participants to know more about climate change, but as you said, these conversations aren't really the place. It's not a classroom where you're going to go through Climate Change 101. So how can we best get that information to people?
Yes, thanks, Leanne. I think this is the key question that, for me, is emerging in the field of communicating climate change at the moment, and I'm not certain anyone's got the answer. There has been a kind of a retreat from providing, the science is quite stark in a way. There's not a huge amount of good news around what unmitigated climate change emissions mean, or even mitigated to some extent. And so these have been seen as like doom and gloom messages that leave people feeling disempowered, disengaged, and indifferent. Well, what can I do? It's all too late. And so there's been a shift to talking about the positives, the co-benefits of it. Move to clean energy, then we'll have cleaner air, people will be cycling, living healthier, all very good stuff, but all of a sudden kind of climate change is disappearing from the conversations. So we don't mention climate change, don't mention the impacts of climate change. I feel that we've kind of reached a bit of a crux here, and all I can say is that the conversations have revealed to me just how I kind of got ourselves in a bit of a pickle here. People want this information. The research is saying that when you give that to people, sometimes it has a negative effect. So I think to some extent, and this is happening a bit, the media needs to get better at being consistent in messaging. That would be at least a start in terms of having people who say, well, it's not a problem, or immediately after scientists on sharing their warnings from the science. That I think would need to stop. A lot of people talk about school and education, important, but it's got, that might be 20 years before the people at school at the moment are in a position to enact anything they've learned. So I think we need to work a bit more quickly than perhaps working through schools will allow. So sorry, I haven't got any easy answers to that, but yeah, if anyone has, I'd be pleased to hear them.
Okay, thank you, Chris. If there are any more questions, do send them in using the chat feature. We just have one that's just come in. So actually, they're all starting to come in now. We have a question about whether, Chris, you have found any interesting, meaningful, any interesting, meaningful ways to connect the ideas or opinions expressed in these conversations to top-down organizing?
I think I would just repeat, yeah, that is a good question. In terms of ways, I think I would come to some kind of key principles, really, which is to know your audience when you're making this organisation. What is it that matters to your audience? What is it that concerns them? And sometimes that means getting to question people beforehand and rooting that in those values, in the identity of the people we're working with. As Raggy said, I think this idea of consistency, and we did hear this in the workshops we did, that I was going to save the planet by buying a diesel car last year. Now I'm a criminal because I've got a climate criminal because I've got a diesel car, or this It's kind of somehow using trusted messengers to break down this lack of trust between, I think it's perhaps, I may be wrong, less pronounced in Scotland, certainly south of the border, some post-Brexit workshops we've been doing, complete lack of trust at the moment. So, short answer, because there's some other questions, I think it's all about building the trust. That is got to be core to any top-down organising, between the organisers and the audience participants.
Thank you, Chris. The next question that we've got here is about how this research might apply to people in developing countries. Sorry, I'm just reading the question.
Yeah.
You got it as well.
Yeah, but I'll tell you what. Okay, I can actually pick it.
You can rephrase the question.
I can rephrase. I can tell you why, because I mentioned that we're looking to apply this in India, and just prior to this afternoon, we've been working on the sort of research handbook for how we're going to take this out to India. And the conversations model is at the core of that. So one of the challenges is this a model? We don't know. I think we've got to ask some questions. I've just put together a contact list of people in India to ask this question of, is this a Western model of democracy that we would try and replicate? People sat around the table, mixed genders, backgrounds, talking rationally about this policy problem. But it implies a certain level of education, it implies a certain set of power relations, it implies a certain set of class and gender relations, and an ideal of what democratic debate should be. So we're actually piloting this with some trainers in India soon to find out. We don't know. I don't know if anyone. I mean, I know some interesting research being done on attitudes to climate change in India, as an example of a poor country, and I can't speak of any others. But there's very low awareness of even that there's such a thing as climate change. So watch this space is all I can say. But we feel there's something there about starting where people are and what matters to them, i.e. we're seeing access to clean water in India. So to start there, well, what does climate change mean for that? But then also, for me to sit here as a Westerner and generalise about the whole Indian population, I think would be probably dangerous. And so I think it may be different for different audiences according to their level of education. So that's a bit of a garbled response, but yeah, very interesting question, and be happy to catch up with you as we work through that project. Okay,
thank you very much, Chris. So just looking through the questions that are coming in, we've got one here about the role of politicians. So the question is, so one thing I've come across is that when people show their despair at being able to make change, or it's the whole "what can I do," it usually stems from the fact that our politicians aren't taking the steps necessary to mitigate or adapt. And how can we respond to that, and how can that fit into a climate conversation?
Yeah, thank you. That's again, this comes to this trust issue, which is, I think, I found it quite profoundly shocking actually. The lack of trust at the moment south of the border between people and politicians. How do you rebuild that? I mean, for me, genuinely, and I know they're not perfect, and this isn't about the S&P, but just about what's happening in Scotland, seems like quite a shining example. And then certainly you could say, well, okay, that's not ideal, and people might talk about what changes made recently to fuel duty, etc. in Scotland, I don't know, but nonetheless, I feel that there is a serious commitment in Scotland to meeting those targets. And in the UK, there are, again, almost as challenging targets in south of the border in Wales and England that are set in stone. I don't know quite what the punishment is if people don't achieve them, but nonetheless, there's a legally binding targets there. And just recently, I saw some box on the website, I think it's David Roberts, just listing the things I think happened recently about HFCs and other initiatives. So some people are claiming that there are things you can look to out there at the moment with the signing of the UN agreement, UNFCCC agreements, even though, again, the commitments there aren't enough to limit to 2 degrees But it's, and I think also then, well, what can people do? Well, it's about what we want to do. We see key is if we break the climate silence at grassroots level and people are talking about it, it becomes more difficult for politicians to backslide on the commitments because they know people are aware of this, conscious of it, recognise what it means to backslide on the commitments, and it becomes harder for governments to do that. So no easy. People have sought ways to hold politicians to account for many years, and but this is certainly an area that needs to be done with great urgency. So I think there are areas that can be done, but there's a lot of mistrust at the moment, unfortunately.
Thank you, Chris. And our last question, and it's getting to the end of the hour, is could this toolkit or a similar approach be applied to other sectors of society, example with businesses, to help them discover the opportunities and challenges that a low-carbon future presents?
Absolutely, yeah, great question. Again, it starts with where people are. So it's a framework. In terms of that core principle of what matters to you, what are the things you're concerned about? Now, obviously, if my concern is that I want 10 Jags and my own private jet, reconciling that with the need to limit emissions is a bit difficult. But nonetheless, you start the conversation then, I think, then it becomes, so you adapt those core principles, what the resources are that you use to engage a conversation may be different. But in terms of not starting with the science, not starting with graphs and all the rest of it, whether it's business or any other group, it's understanding the audience, ideally working, having a trusted messenger that can introduce you or be the one who runs the conversation. And from there, you start and you build up. But you don't go in with any, this is what you must agree at the end. But it's just getting people talking. I mean, just to do that. At the moment, I come back to this term, climate silence. It just seems incredible that we see records being broken about rising temperatures and the impacts of climate change day by day, and no one can talk about it. We can just start that and start that with as many groups as possible. It may not solve everything, but I don't see how we can get anywhere with a solution if we're not all understanding the nature of the challenges that we face. So I hope that helps.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Chris, and thank you, Raghi, as well, and everybody for joining us. As I mentioned, I will be sending out a recording to everybody who registered, and we thank you again very much for your interest in this project, and do get in touch if you'd like to discuss it further with Chris or Raghi. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for your time. Any questions?
Bye. Thank you.